what is the GDPR? It's the General Data Protection Regulation. It comes into effect on the 25th of May this year, so a little under 2 months left of the 2-year transition period. And at that point, it will replace the existing Data Protection Act in the UK, and it will replace the similar types of legislation across the rest of the European Union, which different member states put into place in order to ensure that they were complying with the Data Protection Directive. The reality was that the Data Protection Directive gave rise to a very unequal playing field across Europe, both in terms of the steps that organizations had to go through to demonstrate compliance, but also in terms of enabling data subjects to know how they might go about enforcing their rights. And GDPR brings in a much leveler playing field. It puts individuals into a position where they have are able to have a proper sense of ownership of their personal data, real understanding and control over how their personal data is collected and processed, and requiring those organizations that process personal data to do so in a much more transparent and legally consistent way. One of the requirements of GDPR, and it's an extensive piece of legislation, which, again, if you're not aware of that, goes into force exactly as written in all 28 member states, other than where the regulation allows for member states to put in place their own particular interpretation or requirements around specific aspects. So to all intents and purposes, in all the major areas, it's the same regulation, the same requirements, the same fines, the same for all organizations in all member states. And one of the requirements is that organizations have to adopt appropriate procedures and processes to protect personal data. And this involves taking a risk-based approach to data protection, building a workplace culture around data protection and security. The Information Commissioner captured that 18 months ago when she talked about GDPR as driving organizations to embed a culture of privacy in the organization, to embed data protection by design and by default in all of the organization's processes. And one of the requirements of GDPR when looking at security is that organizations should take account of the state of the art and take account of risks of various sorts, threats and vulnerabilities to the rights and freedoms of natural persons, put in place appropriate controls. In other words, GDPR recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to cybersecurity in respect of data protection. There is no single checklist that every single organization can follow. There is a set of principles which organizations have to be able to demonstrate they've properly understood and applied. And that proper understanding is captured in the concept for boards and managements of the requirement that organizations have to be accountable for data protection. And it's one of the specific requirements of Clause 5 of the standard that organizations should be able to demonstrate they've put into place the 6 data processing principles across all of the data processing which they do. One of the common questions that organizations ask is, how do we prove we're in compliance with GDPR? And the sad truth is that you can't prove you're in compliance with GDPR because the practical reality is that it's a law, and the detail of what is and isn't compliance is going to be decided in law courts around the European Union and ultimately in the European Court of Justice on appeal at various points over the next 5 to 15 years. But no organization can afford to wait until points are thrashed out by lawyers. You've got to get on with complying. You've got to do the best you can to demonstrate that you've taken appropriate steps to secure the organization. And GDPR specifically allows organizations to use management standards and systems as a way to do that. And we're going to look at ISO 27001 and how an ISO 27001 aligned management system can support GDPR compliance. So just looking then, coming at ISO 27001 from the simple starting point that what GDPR requires is that an organization should be able to demonstrate compliance with, it accepts that it's accountable for, and demonstrates compliance with the requirements around the 6 data processing principles, one of which, of course, is that data should be protected. An information security management system is a structured, systematic approach to managing information security, or cybersecurity if you prefer, and the world of standards, the world that's produced ISO 9001 has also produced IEC 27001, which is a management system standard for dealing with information security. And it's a standard which you can implement. It's a specification that sets out things that an organization must do if it's to claim compliance with the standard, and it is accompanied by an accredited certification scheme, so it is possible for an organization to have a third-party audit carried out of its management system, which provides evidence, if evidence is required, that its management system is actually certified to the international standard. So ISO 27001 is a standard for ensuring that the organization puts in place appropriate measures to deal with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of confidential or sensitive information. And it's supported by a body of other international standards, perhaps one of the more important of which is ISO 27002, which is a standard that sets out guidance on how to apply a number of controls, each one of which is referenced in the annex to ISO 27001. And there are really 3 pillars, in just the same way as management system is focused on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the management system is built around the logic of making sure that what you do in terms of people, processes, and technology is going to be carried out in a way that will effectively ensure the organization's information security is appropriate. But before we look at information security management systems, let's just touch briefly on the type of risks that result in data breaches, because the important thing to bear in mind is that the data breach reporting mechanisms are very clearly laid out in GDPR. The first step is that if you're a data processor and you have a breach of any sort, of any level of severity, you have to report that breach to the data controller with whom you have a contract within 72 hours or as soon as you become aware of it. We would expect that if it takes you 142 days, which is the average UK period to identify a data breach, by the time you report it, you're not going to be met with a great deal of pride that it's taken you so long. You don't want it to take a long time. So you need to find out and you report it to a data controller. Data controllers have to make a decision. From a data controller point of view, there are 3 options. If the data breach doesn't create a risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects, then they don't have to report it to the supervisory authority. If it does create a risk, then it must be reported. And if it creates a high risk, then the data subjects themselves also have to be informed. That means that it will make sense for all data controllers to have in place a risk assessment methodology which enables them to determine what the level of risk is. Is it no risk, is it risk, or is it high risk? Because breaches that occurred inside your own organization or which are reported to you by processors, you'll need to do the triage, you'll need to assess the severity of the breach and decide whether or not you're going to report it. If you decide it's not reportable, that's fine. You will need to keep records of how you made the decision, because sooner or later you're going to have a breach that you do need to report, and that's likely to occasion an investigation. And an investigation will look at all of your activities, not just the breach itself. And so you want to be in a position where if an investigation uncovers the fact that you've had previous breaches, you made proper decisions about what to do and that you followed through on them. So let's look at breaches that could come about in relation to personal data that either you or a processor of yours will experience. 75% of breaches, this is the 2017 Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, and there are a range of different reports that you can access produced by different organizations. They'll give you a variety of answers which all add up to much the same kind of picture. 75% of breaches are perpetrated by outsiders. 51% by organized criminal groups, 25% involve internal actors, and breaches here can be both accidental and deliberate. 18% are breaches caused by state-affiliated actors. A data breach in GDPR is clearly defined. It's a compromise of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of personal data, particularly in respect to the purposes for which it was collected. And it's any breach. It includes accidental deletion of data. That would be a breach. It might not create a risk, so it might not be need to be reported to the Information Commissioner, but it's still a breach. So you've got to work out how you protect yourself against this range of potential breaches, which could happen internally or externally, and you've got to think about how you're going to discover them and how you're going to deal with them. 62%, the most common tactics used to bring those breaches around, and you can now read about breaches virtually every single day in virtually every single newspaper. 62% of breaches involve some form of hacking. 51% of breaches included malware, 81% leveraged stolen password or compromised passwords, 43% social engineering attacks, 14% just errors or privilege misuse, local administrator privileges being misused to do something that shouldn't have been allowed, or which involves some form of physical ingress or contact, maybe uploading, maybe plugging in a compromised USB stick, or being able to access a secure area. So it's mostly about digital attacks. So it's mostly about attacks at a distance, dealing with attackers who are nowhere near you and who are able to compromise holes in your digital defenses. Might include encouraging you to download malware, might be an email with a purchase order that you're excited to get, in which when you click on the link downloads malware. It could be leveraging the fact that you have staff using extremely weak passwords. All of them highly common, highly normal attacks. So how do you deal with those kinds of tactics? How do you prevent the breaches? And the answer is, of course, to look at it from the perspective of what can we achieve by putting an information security management system in. If the reality is we have to deal with a wide range of potential attacks, a wide range of possible breaches, then we have to do more than simply try and focus on individual types of attacks, because we don't know which particular attack is going to come next. We need something which is going to enable us to defend ourselves on a more systematic basis. And that's really where a management system, an information security management system, comes in. And a standard like ISO 27001, and there aren't any others, I'm not picking it because I prefer it, it's just the international standard for information security management. It applies to all forms of information, so not just personal data. And that means that from an organizational perspective, the management system you're putting in place to protect personal data is also going to protect confidential information that might apply to financial information or intellectual property or mergers and acquisitions information. Good security, therefore, can reduce the need for frequent audits. It's certainly going to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, which could help you win new customers, help you retain existing customers. And increasingly, we live in a world where clients are going to want to know that their data is secure. Day after day after day, and if you subscribe to our free newsletter Sentinel, there's a fairly regular summary of data breaches. There's more information about organizations breached with 30,000 records or 100,000 records exposed, or an organization which was compromised and paid out large amounts of money to a fraudulent attacker. A management system will enable you to respond to changes in the threat environment, should improve the company's culture, its structure, its focus. So many threats are designed to take advantage of inadequate knowledge and skills among staff, and a management system should enable you to have a structured way of spreading knowledge and understanding throughout the organization. Should bring information security costs down, facilitate compliance with laws and regulations, and of course, it's because management system, you're able to get an independent view rather than having to rely entirely on internal view, and that can give you a much better, more robust security position than you might otherwise have. So I said already, the three pillars of an information security management system are people, processes, and technology. Technology on its own can't make you secure. Technology won't work on its own. You need people to ensure it's configured correctly, and you need a process to ensure that that configuration is deployed correctly. And so the three pillars of information security work both on their own and together: staff training and awareness, proper skills and competences, adequate resources need to be balanced by documented procedures, need to be balanced by accountability, governance, and privacy compliance frameworks, supported by IT audits, and with effectively deployed technology to deal systematically with malware, with where you can, early identification of phishing attacks, and so on. So you're looking for a management system which enables you to work effectively across those three areas. And you need to work effectively across those three areas because GDPR is being very clear in talking about the requirements around technical and organizational measures. In Article 32, and you need to be thinking of GDPR's requirements around information security, both in terms of the 6th data processing principles, which says in simple terms the data must be processed securely in the context of what has been collected for, and Article 32, which says that the organization has to deploy appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect data. You have to decide what is appropriate. As I said, there's no tick box. You have to decide what's appropriate on the basis of the value of the data, the sensitivity of the data, the volume of the data, on the context within which you're processing it, in terms of the environment within which you're processing it, and above all in terms of the risks to the data subjects themselves. You specifically therefore have to think about, how do I ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data, and how do I ensure the resilience of the processing itself? If you think about the ransomware breach which occurred during the middle of 2017, there were a number of NHS trusts which were unable to carry out planned operations, or which had to postpone operations, which had to cancel people coming in for particular treatments on the basis that data was compromised. And those trusts claimed, some of them claimed, that they hadn't suffered a data breach. Well, of course, that's not correct. They had suffered a data breach. The ransomware had meant that the data was not available for the purposes for which it was collected. And from a GDPR perspective, that would undoubtedly be something which would or could lead to supervisory action and potentially, of course, to a fine. So resilience of processing services is just as important as the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. You need to be able to restore systems in a timely manner, and timely is driven by the combination of how quickly does the system need to be working and how far back do we want to be prepared to go in restoring data. And those are two considerations that have to be part of deciding how you're going to restore the systems. And you can really only be sure that a management system is working if you're regularly testing and evaluating the effectiveness of the system and of your processes. So an effective ISO 27001 management system is going to meet the requirements of GDPR, of Article 32 in GDPR, enabling the organization to secure data, but to demonstrate that the data is secure and it's operating in a way that is going to appropriately protect the rights and freedoms of data subjects. So a management system then, an information security management system, and this now applies pretty well to every ISO management system, starts off with setting the context for the management system. So the context will be the industry or the sector in which you operate, the size of the organization, the appetite for risk of management, the current effectiveness of security processes. What's the context of the management system? What are the objectives that is being set for the management system? What are the legal and regulatory requirements? The second area management systems focus on is leadership, recognizing that implementing anything, a quality management system, a medical devices testing system, an information security management system, can't be done without proper accountability, without leadership from the board or senior management, and clarity in all the key roles through the organization as to what is supposed to be done in terms of information security. Leadership also obviously involves making sure you've got competent people, but it really is about leadership, about setting an example, about ensuring that there are appropriate budgets and capabilities in place. Management systems also require planning, and planning for information security is fundamentally not just about making sure you've got the right contact groups, but it's about risk assessment. It's about a methodology that enables you to assess risks not only to the organization, but also to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. And you need to bear in mind, if you're thinking about risk assessment, that the answer to those two questions could be different. That a risk to the organization that management might be prepared to accept could also be a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons, of data subjects, that they wouldn't accept. And so you might need to adopt a set of controls or a set of treatments to those risks which are different in the context of the organization and of the individual. So planning is a really critical element of looking at information security management. You need to work out how you're going to support the plan. So supporting the plan is about staff training and awareness. It's about how you select and manage people. It's about rolling roles and responsibilities down through the organization, about documenting processes. And that then becomes part of the day-to-day operation of the management system. And for an information security management system, that'll include incident management. It will include links to business continuity planning. It will include all of the components of making sure that the ISMS is achieving the objectives that were set for it. Obviously, therefore, you'd want to set objectives, not just at the top level, but also at appropriate levels down through the organization, which link to what the organization is trying to achieve and which are realizable objectives for those for whom they've been set. Performance evaluation and improvement, they pretty well go together from a management system perspective. Management systems today are built on the idea that they should continually improve, that whatever you deploy in the first instance won't be perfect. It won't completely suit your environment, but the better thing to do is to get it in place, make it work, and then look at how you can improve it on the basis of experience. So a management system is not just a set of controls, it's a way to approach decisions about what controls to put in place and how to determine whether those controls are achieving the objectives that you set for them. So good security, therefore, built out of that idea of those concepts of what's in a management system, good security in any organization will always be evidenced by the fact that board and leadership, senior leadership, are committed to it. Senior management will be amongst the first to make sure that they do things in a way that is secure, that it protects data. They will make sure that there are no special permissions given to them so they can bypass security checks. They will have made sure there is proper commitment of resource funding and all of those kind of things to enable the organization to achieve its objectives. Information security has to involve the entire organization. It's not just an IT or compliance activity, because anybody who accesses data can destroy it or can compromise it. Anybody who's carrying a paper file of confidential information and leaves it on the train compromises the organization. Anybody who downloads a piece of malware inadvertently compromises the organization. So everybody in the organization has to be involved, has to understand their role and contribution, and they have to understand it in the context of the genuine risks the organization has identified. You should never be in a position where somebody in the security team says, well, I think there's a risk, therefore we can't do X, Y, and Z, because the reality is management should make the decisions about the criteria on which risk is judged. And it's perfectly acceptable to accept some risks, to say it's not worth our while investing in a control, or to say this control here would make it impossible for us to operate. Those are reasonable business decisions. And ISO 27001 recognizes it. Frankly, one of the original reasons that I got involved with information security was because as a manager, I recognized that ISO 27001 put me in a very clear position to ensure that my IT and security teams fitted with what I wanted rather than with whatever they thought was a good idea. Good security is built around people, process, and technology in exactly the way I talked about earlier on, and protects all data. It protects the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all data. From a GDPR point of view, of course, it's the personal data that matters, but so often personal data is embedded in other data and other systems. So protecting all data makes a lot of sense. Continual improvements and regular reviews, ongoing internal audits, that would be part of a good security system. External audit is a way that you can satisfy yourself that you're doing what you believe you're doing rather than just pretending. And it's following best practice. You're not trying to make up something on your own. You're taking advantage of work others have done before you, where there's been a chance to iron out many of the weaknesses that might otherwise exist. And therefore, a good security system is one that's also likely to be recognized both nationally and internationally. So how do you get started? You're thinking about GDPR. You may not have made a lot of progress with GDPR, and there's less than 2 months. One of the key things that you want to be doing, if you've still got a long way to go in terms of GDPR compliance, is to get yourself secure. You get into trouble with the where GDPR is concerned in 2 ways. The first is by having to report a data breach, and the second is by having an individual bring an action against you, either in a court or as a complaint to a supervisory authority. And so making sure that you've got really good customer data subject facing processes and you really protected data are 2 of the logical things to do, and to do as quickly as possible so that you can avoid the possibility of being up, so to speak, with an accusation or a breach. And that should give you, if you do this, tell it to do this sensibly, enough time to really embed data protection by default and by design. So how do you get started with ISO 27001? There's a very straightforward 9-step process. I've written about it in a book called 9 Steps to Success. It's the basis of our lead implementer training course. It's a very widely accepted way to build a management system, and it starts with the recognition that you need a project mandate. You need senior level commitments to the project. You need information security goals. You need objectives for why you're doing it, and that enables you then to initiate the project. It's a change project, putting an ISO 27001 management system in place. So set up a project team, put in place a RACI matrix, a responsible, accountable, consulted and informed chart, so that across all of the key areas of a process, you're making sure you're talking to the right people. But set up a project, set up internal communications around it, and then you can start on the information security management system itself. And because it's going to be documented, you need to determine what the documentation mechanisms are going to be. You're going to use preferably exactly the same way of issuing documents and updating documents as you do for data protection, any other management system. And then you can start building out the management framework. What's the scope of the ISMS? Which bits of the organization are going to be covered? Where are the interfaces and handoffs with other organizations? What's our information security policy going to be? And a policy in this context is set at a high level and signed off by senior management to give direction to the organization around protecting data. The communication policy for the project and for the ISMS should be derived from that, as should the requirements around competences of staff. And those competences are likely to be in terms of information security built into other roles and information security people who deal, for instance, with incident management and related activity. The 5th step is identifying what we call baseline security criteria, the controls you have to have in place in order to meet specific business, legal, or regulatory requirements. And there are a number of those controls that you have to have in place, for instance, to meet GDPR requirements or to meet requirements set in contracts with customers. If you're an organization that accepts and processes payment cards, contractually you should have been complying in at least the part of your business that deals with payment cards with the PCI data security standard. And in complying with that, you've got a set of controls you need to put in place, and you put them in as part of your baseline security criteria. Assess the effectiveness of them, make sure that you've got in place all of the controls you should do, and that's your starting point. You now move on to think about what other risks do we have? What risks are there that we've not identified or that our baseline security criteria are not dealing with? And your risk assessment should enable you to make sure that the level or the extent of the controls you've got in place are appropriate, and should enable you to identify other areas of risk that you've not yet dealt with. Quite often those might be major level risks like distributed denial of service attacks, or it might be major acts of nature, could be equipment failure. There's a whole bunch of things that your baseline security criteria, baseline security controls might not have pulled up that come out of your risk assessment. So you do a risk assessment. The risk assessment should be a formal and objective mechanism for establishing risk, something which doesn't depend on whoever did the risk assessment turning up for you to know what on earth was decided. It should be something that anyone should be able to follow. And out of that, you can identify the controls that you need to put in place, both the controls you've got and the additional controls that you need to put in place, what we call a statement of applicability, a statement listing the applicable controls to achieve your security objectives. You implement them. What do we need to change in terms of the way the organization currently operates to put these controls in place? Implement the controls, carry out a staff awareness and training program, and then make sure that the ISMS is doing what it should be doing. So start measuring effectiveness, analyzing how well the control works, evaluating the effect on your business objectives of those controls. If necessary, change and amend the controls to get them to work better. Build internal audits and management review into how the management system works, so that on a regular basis, at least once a year, management is reviewing the overall effectiveness of the management system. And then the ninth step, if as an organization you recognize the value of external certification, is have an external certification audit by a certification body who can sending in a specially trained ISO 27001 auditor, assess the extent of your compliance and tell you whether or not you are actually in compliance with GDPR, with ISO 27001 or not. If you are, you'll shortly thereafter get a certificate of compliance. You'll be able to use the certificate of compliance at any point somebody says, is your information security adequate? Yes, you'll be able to say, it is, here's our certificate of compliance. Bearing in mind though, of course, that an ISO 27001 certificate doesn't prove that you've complied with GDPR. What it proves is you've done the best you can to deploy a systematic set of administrative, organizational, operational controls to meet GDPR's requirements around information security. So I've talked quite a lot about risk assessment. Let me just come back to it. The logic of risk assessment is that it should drive the selection of controls. It's right at the heart of ISO 27001. Although there are controls which you put in place because you've got a contractual regulatory business obligation to put them in place, the risk assessment itself is a separate process. And as I said, it should enable you to arrive at decisions about controls which are repeatable, transparent, traceable, consistent. In other words, somebody else following your methodology will arrive at the same decisions that you did about the level of risk that's acceptable and about the control to put in place. Once you've done a risk assessment, you can make the decision. What are you going to do? Are you going to avoid the risk? Are you going to modify it by applying a control? Are you going to share the risk, usually by means of insurance? Or are you going to retain the risk? In other words, do nothing about it. Say, we'll live with the risk. It's way too big an expense to bring under control, and the likelihood of it happening is way too small to make it worthwhile. So risk assessment at the heart of an ISO 27001 ISMS should also be at the heart of your approach to GDPR, given GDPR's requirement to taking account of the state of the art and risks of various sorts, the rights and freedoms of natural persons, select controls. Got to be right at the heart of what you do. So you then have to think about what are the controls where you've decided to modify a risk. What controls are we going to put in place? Where do you get controls from? Annex A of ISO 27001 includes a list of 114 controls spread across 14 different categories, which include pretty well everything that you might need to be able to deal with risk. You don't have to implement all of the controls. You implement only those that your risk assessment tells you you need to put in place. And those are the controls you want to make sure operate effectively in a way that you need them to. And your statement of applicability, the list of controls that you've implemented, and your risk assessment are part of the core documentation that enables you to maintain your management system as you go forward, because your management system should be a growing, living part of a growing, living GDPR compliance activity. So the 114 controls, they are, as I said, spread across 14 different categories. The guidance on how to implement the controls is contained in ISO 27002, following exactly the same structure. Starts with information security policies, high-level policies about how to manage information security, looks at organization of information security, human resources, so that's before, during, and after employment. How do you make sure the people you're employing are going to be secure? What testing do you need to do? How do you terminate the employment of people who turn out not to be prepared to follow the information security requirements? Managing assets, not just information assets, but obviously the personal databases, key part of GDPR. If you're thinking about the requirements to do a database, data inventory and data flow mapping, that ties very closely into the asset management controls of ISO 27001. A9, access control, is obviously going to be an important set of controls from a GDPR point of view, because they're really about who can access data and protecting data, making sure that personal data can't be accessed by those who are not entitled to see it, obviously is one of the critical GDPR controls. So selecting appropriately the controls listed in A9 is a good part of your GDPR activity. Don't want to understate the importance of cryptography. A10 is dealing with encryption. And encryption from a GDPR point of view can be applied to data at rest or in flight, whether it's in email or any other method of movement, or at rest in databases. And the reason encryption is important is that the ICO considers clearly, if you look at a website, that where data is encrypted and encrypted to a high standard like FIPS 140-2, then if there is a data breach, there is no risk to data subjects. And that means that you can have a data breach and say a laptop is lost, clearly a data breach, but the data on the laptop is boot encrypted. You're simply going to recover the data, recover the laptop. You don't need to report that because there is no risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. If you lose a laptop which is not encrypted, you have to report it. There is certainly a risk, and you can expect some form of fine. The Information Commissioner is very clear that losing a laptop that's unencrypted is kind of a bit stupid, really. So cryptography, that's a set of controls which is really, really important from a GDPR compliance point of view. A12 and A13 are two sets of controls that work alongside one another. They are dealing with how the IT operations and IT comms work, making sure that you've got appropriate policies and procedures, that you've got appropriate security in systems, that you've got appropriate protection around comms, both physical and environmental. And A14 then looks at the acquisition, development, and maintenance of systems, recognizing that it's very easy to bring in systems and then think about data security later on. And the requirement for data protection by design and by default is going to be reflected in how you deploy controls around acquisition, development, and maintenance. If, for instance, you're a project management software project company, you'll want to build DPIAs and data protection considerations into most of the Scrum activity that you've got to ensure that data protection is dealt with by default in your Agile project management methodology. Supplier relationships, think of the number of breaches which have taken place because suppliers have been able to breach security of their customers. So driving security through the supply chain, enforcing security on suppliers is dealt with in A15. And A16 deals with incidents. Remember that incidents, something goes wrong, can very quickly turn into a data breach that has to be reported. So A16 is a control set that is, again, going to be a key part of building GDPR compliance. Business continuity, A17, there's a link between incident management, information security, and a broader business continuity plan. If you're dealing with how the organization survives a major threat, then you'd want to make sure that these links are effective. And A18 then is about compliance, both compliance with intellectual property legislation, with GDPR itself, with other privacy regulations, but also compliance by your own organization with your own standards and requirements. So it's a very comprehensive set of controls. An organization can draw on them to ensure that that you've got an appropriate level of security. So 14 categories of controls, 114 controls, and how can we help you with your GDPR journey? Obviously, we can do an awful lot simply in terms of GDPR compliance. We've got a major GDPR offering around foundation and practitioner training, around consultancy support, as well as a very substantial range of tools for data flow mapping, for DPIAs, for documentation, books and manuals, and so on. But when you come to look at information security in particular, that core of GDPR, the data protection part of GDPR, well, you can get from us copies of the international standard. We're a distributor for both BSI and IEC. You can get ISO 27001 training courses, foundation, lead implementer, and lead auditor. We've got a very substantial range of consultancy services, including a fast track offering for small businesses, which enables them quite cost effectively to get compliant without having to find hard to get resources, implementation guidance, documentation toolkits, risk assessment tools, a comprehensive range of resources and tools. We think we probably helped more organizations worldwide prepare for or achieve ISO 27001 than anybody else. So what we've got in our tools is something like 12 years worth of practical experience built in to help organizations put in place an information security management system which helps with the ongoing compliance requirements around GDPR. I've touched on these. There is a couple of special offers available. You can do our training courses in the classroom, live online, or through distance learning. And of course, you can get hold of us through any one of the normal channels on our website, through email, by telephone, and we're on social media and so on. So if there's anything that you'd like us to do to help you with ISO 27001, with Cyber Essentials, with GDPR, do feel free to contact us. And that brings us to the question and answer session. So I'm going to turn to those. If you haven't already, please remember that you can use the Q&A function in GoToWebinar. You can type a question into there, and I will go through the questions. I'll pick up the first question, I'll read it out and share the answer with everybody, and I'll work through as many questions as I can in the remaining 13 or 14 minutes. And do feel free, you can ask questions around ISO 27001 or GDPR, or any of the aspects that we've tackled, that we've touched on through today. Quick question in relation to completing questionnaires for companies conducting GDPR due diligence. Are we legally obliged to provide details to anybody who asks? What level of detail is adequate to send? No, you're not legally obliged to provide details to anybody who asks. Absolutely not. The practical reality is that you're obliged to tell data subjects what you're planning to do with their data, and you're obliged to comply with the requirements in terms of data protection and processing of any controllers with whom you have contracts. There certainly are, and we get them as well, organizations who say, well, we think we've heard of you, we might do business with you one day, please tell us whether you're GDPR compliant or not. At one level, they're frankly wasting your time. You're probably better off getting on with embedding data protection in your organization than you are with responding to their questionnaires. If you're going to respond to their questionnaire, you probably want to be finding out what in particular they want to be doing with you. Are they planning to buy from you? Are they planning to share personal data with you on a controller-to-controller basis, or are they planning to contract with you where you'd be processing personal data on their behalf? But no, you're not legally obliged to share information with them. If you are a processor and you have a contract, then yes, you're going to be legally obliged to do that, both under GDPR and under the terms of your contract. But outside of that, nope. If your company has less than 50 employees, are you exempt from having every process documented end to end? The answer is that it depends. There is a derogation in GDPR which says that organizations with under 250 employees do not have to document the processing, that's the Article 30 requirements around processing, if there is no risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. If there is no risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. That means you need to have made sure there isn't a risk. And that, I think, means that at the very least, you have every single bit of personal data encrypted at rest and in flight. And you've got some very, very clear rules around who can access data. Might still be iffy. Might still be somebody will come along and argue and say, well, actually there was a risk, you just simply reduced the risk by putting controls in place. So we won't know the true answer to this question until somebody's brought the case to law. But what the law said, brought the case to court, what the law says is that if there is no risk to rights and freedoms, you don't need to document, and you're under 250 employees, you don't need to document the processing of data. What is classified as risk? Example, someone has imported data from a CRM into their Outlook. Outlook is hacked and the email address then sends an email containing malware. Does this then fall on the controller? Yes, it does. The controller, the organization that determines the means and purposes of processing, is the controller for GDPR purposes. It's up to the controller to make sure that appropriate security measures are in place to protect that data. If you allow data to be exported from wherever you collected it into an insecure Outlook system, then you are going to be at fault. You will be on the hook for the exposure. Controllers' accountability is pretty well absolute in this sense. If ISO 27001 goes most of the way towards GDPR compliance, do you think that one of the main challenges to raise all staff awareness of their responsibilities in terms of handling personal data? Do you think ISO 27001 was felt more like the domain of IT and senior management rather than all employees thus far? Okay, so it's a management system and it sets out, you are right, the requirements that management has to ensure are put in place around the whole organization. Frankly, you can have an ISO 27001 compliance certificate without having told the organization that you're pursuing ISO 27001. They don't need to know that. They do need to know that they have an obligation to protect data. They do need to be trained appropriately, and you need to be able to evidence that they are trained appropriately, they're following the procedures that you need them to follow, and all that kind of thing. ISO 27001 is simply a standard against which your actual behaviors will be judged. What guidance is there for the destruction of data? Well, GDPR doesn't give you guidance. It simply says that at the end of the period for which the data was collected, the end of the period of processing, then the data must be deleted or destroyed. Now, the practical, if you think about the intersection of requirements, that means that you have to delete that data, but you can't delete data which might be relevant to some other purpose. There might be data which you have to retain to meet statutory or regulatory objectives, which you can't delete, even though the original purpose for processing is no longer there. And in deleting it, you need to make sure it is actually deleted. So just simply deleting something without making sure that it can't be resurrected on the hard drive, that wouldn't be deleting it. It needs to be securely deleted. There are problems in deleting data from archives and backups, and technology doesn't yet really exist to make that easy to do. There are workarounds which the ICO has made available, but as an organization, you need to be thinking very hard about the extent to which you retain backups and archives of data. You might come to the conclusion that you shouldn't be keeping backups for longer than maybe 6 months or a year. You might have a look at how often you need to go back into archives to pull data and make decisions on that basis about how long you're going to keep data that you might be forced to destroy, or you might be forced to provide in response to their data subject access request. If the organization is compliant with ISO 27001, can it be construed that it is compliant with GDPR? I wish that were so. What you can construe is that the organization has taken appropriate steps driven by management on the basis of a risk assessment to protect all data, including personal data. You can argue that meets the GDPR requirement to protect personal data. Whether that's adequate or not is going to depend on reality. If there is a major data breach and the controls selected were inadequate, then ISO 27001 will simply demonstrate that you made a good attempt but not a good enough attempt. So context will be all. ISO 27001 goes a substantial distance to demonstrating that in terms of protecting data, you're compliant with GDPR, but it doesn't demonstrate that you're necessarily compliant in all the other aspects of your compliance obligations. Would one expect a supplier, a data processor that had a breach of security for another client to report this to the data controller, or would this have to be found out through the ICO? So if a data processor has a breach of I think this is something which you can deal with in your contract. Certainly, a processor is going to be obliged to tell the controller for whom it's processing that there has been a breach. I see no reason why, as a controller, if you're dealing with a processor that you know is dealing with a number of other organizations, you can't require it to tell you when there has been a breach of certain types that might potentially have affected you as well as somebody else. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to build into your contract, and you might have to negotiate a bit, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to build into your contract. We're an EdTech company. We do have lots of gaps at the moment, especially in access types and user roles. We were wondering if we could use ISO 27000 to a set of guidelines without actually investing this year into developing a proper ISMS. We're under-resourced to do this year. We already have 9001 and 14001, so we know it's no walk in the park. Yes, you can use 27002 as a set of controls. The key thing is the requirement around risk assessment, determining which controls to put in place on the basis of a risk assessment. And I think that you could do a light touch, if you like, implementation of ISO 27001, building on your existing management system. It's the same clauses around context, leadership, operations, and so on. Simply build those out to include some of the requirements of ISO 27001 so that you can make risk-based decisions around the controls which you select, and then select and implement those controls, and then come back later on to build out the ISMS. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. What are the rules with regards to reporting data breaches out of normal working hours, such as over a bank holiday? Well, GDPR does not give any guidance on that. What it says explicitly is that you have, as a processor, 72 hours from the breach occurring or you first becoming aware of it to report it to the controller, and a controller has 72 hours from the breach occurring or first becoming aware of it to reporting it to the information commissioner. That to us means quite clearly that if you have a breach on a Friday afternoon, you're going to be reporting that breach by Monday afternoon, 72 hours later. You don't have a whole lot of time to defer just because Saturday and Sunday occurred. And the logic of that, of course, is that many breaches do occur on Fridays because attackers know that IT support organizations are not there over the weekend. It gives them much more time to get away with data. And from a GDPR point of view, that's maximum exposure time for data subjects. So no, bank holidays, weekends, these are calendar hours, not business hours. What's the general opinion on using storage platforms such as Google Drive or OneDrive? Are these secure in your opinion? I'm not going to comment on third parties. These are assessments that as users you have to make for yourself. It's part of your risk assessment methodology. You need to have a look at how those organizations have gone about meeting their compliance requirements, what history there is of data breaches, where data is stored, and you need to make your own decisions on that. These are substantial organizations. You might expect that they're taking appropriate steps to secure data, but I can't tell you that they aren't. The encryption standard is FIPS 140-2, FIPS 140-2 is the encryption standard. It's a globally recognized technical standard for encryption software. What's our perspective on ISO 27018 for cloud providers? Our perspective is a very good standard. If you're a cloud provider, ISO 27018 is an additional set of controls that can be referenced in your ISO 27001 certificate, and there are controls which are appropriate to an organization operating in the cloud. So Microsoft, for instance, did that a year or more ago. Their ISO 27001 compliance certificate very clearly says that they've also complied with the requirements of ISO 27018. It's a good standard. Can you clarify whether employees are required to consent to use their data for employment purposes? Is a privacy policy sufficient? So the answer to this question is consent is invalid for processing employee data. GDPR is specific that consent has to be given freely, and that means between bodies of equal standing, and as the ICO's guidance already said, an employer and an employee are not of equal standing. Therefore, any processing of employee data on the basis of consent will be invalid. That automatically means that you're processing it illegally. So you need between now and May the 25th to transition all processing of employee data away from consent. It's typically one of the clauses in their contracts of employment. You need to update them, and you'll be processing data on the basis of one of a number of the other options listed in Article 6. In order to fulfill a contract would be one, to meet your statutory obligations might be another, potentially legitimate interest, because legitimate interest includes tracking behaviors to ensure people are complying with information security policy. So not consent for employee processing. Are there any automatic breach detection tools? None that I'm afraid I talk about with any level of certainty. What's the penalty in case of the data breach of a company? How does that process happen in case of a data breach? Well, data breaches, the penalties go up to 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, depending on which is higher. The regulator has to take account of the extent of negligence, and the fine has to be proportionate to the breach. So they can't fine you for 20 million euros if it's a minor breach. It has to be proportionate. And it's determined by the regulator carrying out an investigation after they've been made aware. They'll collect all the data, they'll do forensics if they need to, and they'll arrive at a conclusion which one would expect they would discuss with you, but they'll then levy a fine. We're running out of time, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm going to try and answer just one or two more questions. Can we complete an ISO 27001 project ourselves as a company, or are we likely to need consulting assistance? The answer is it depends entirely on you. The very first time I did it on my own. There were no consultants available. That's why I wrote the book. There are still organizations who do it on their own. There are organizations who get a bit of help, and organizations who get a lot of help. It's entire, and we've got packages that will help you do that in exactly the way that you want to. And then my last question, should the first step be a data mapping exercise and risk assessment, or what would we suggest? The first step should be a data inventory and data mapping exercise, although I might do a gap analysis across the whole of your GDPR compliance estate first. I might look at everything from accountability through to information security first. And if you want to look at some of the items, if you've been on one of our training courses, we identify what a gap analysis should deal with. And I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we run out of time there. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'm sorry that we don't have time to answer more of the questions that you've asked, but I'd like to wish you success on your GDPR journeys, success if you choose to pursue ISO 27001 or you're linking ISO 27001 to GDPR. If you're already ISO 27001 compliant, make sure that in your context statement to meet clause 4.1, you identify that one of the purposes of ISO 27001 is to meet your GDPR security obligations. There is an ongoing series of webinars. You can read about them on our website. Please do feel free to join them. They're all free. And as I said, if there's anything we can do to help you on your journey, please do get in touch either directly or through our website. And I'd like to wish you a good rest of Thursday, and when you get to it, an enjoyable weekend. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.